I spend a lot of evenings like this, sitting on a dock before sunset, watching the water calm down, listening to the world slow down long enough for my thoughts to catch up with me. And I've noticed something over the years. The questions that follow veterans home rarely show up in the middle of the noise. They show up in moments like this, when the deployment is over, when the mission is over, when there's finally enough silence to hear what's been buried underneath it all.
What if the hardest part of war isn't surviving the battle? What if the hardest part of war comes later, years later, when the deployment's over, the uniforms are packed away, and you're finally alone with your thoughts? Many veterans come home carrying wounds that no one can see. Not wounds of fear, not wounds of the body, but wounds of conscience. Today, we're talking about one of the least understood realities of combat. The moral weight many warriors carry long after their battle ends. And we're going to look at a story that reveals exactly what that burden can sound like when it reaches the human soul. Welcome back to Adkison Outdoors. This is part 2 of our discussion on chapter 4 of my book, Moral Injury and Redemption. Last week, we explored the difference between PTSD and moral injury. PTSD is often rooted in fear and survival. Moral injury is rooted in a wound to the conscious. Today, we're moving deeper in that conversation as we examine the moral and spiritual burden many warriors carry after combat. Combat places human beings into situations that most people will never fully understand. Military training prepares warriors to act decisively under extraordinary circumstances. In combat, hesitation can cost lives. But even when actions are necessary, the human heart still has to process what happened afterward. For decades, military psychologists, chaplains, and historians have observed the same reality. Many service members struggle not only with what happened to them, they struggle with what they witnessed, what they participated in, and what those experiences mean once the battle is over. One of the ways warriors cope is through language. Humor becomes a shield. Distance becomes protection. Difficult realities are often softened because some experiences are simply too heavy to carry directly. But eventually, the mission ends. The deployment ends. And many veterans find themselves wrestling with questions they never expected to face. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman recounts a story that has stayed with me for years. A service member was searching the body of an enemy fighter he had killed during close combat. And as he searched the man's pockets, he found a family photograph. A wife, 2 children, a family. In that moment, the reality of war became intensely personal. There was no longer an enemy, no longer a target, no longer an objective. It was a husband, a father, a human being loved by people who would never see him again. The service member looked at the photo and said, "I murdered their daddy. Soon I will have to answer to my Maker for what I have done." Listen carefully to those words. This isn't simply fear. This isn't merely grief. That is the language of moral injury. It is the cry of a conscience wrestling with guilt, responsibility, forgiveness, and judgment. And for many veterans, those questions don't stay on the battlefield. They follow them home, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. One of the reasons I spend time outdoors is because creation has a way of quieting the noise. Standing beside the water, it's hard to escape your own thoughts. The distractions fade, the pace slows, and the questions you've been avoiding have room to surface. Questions about what happened, questions about guilt, questions about faith, questions about whether forgiveness is really possible. Many veterans spend years trying to outrun those questions, but healing rarely comes from running. Healing begins when we're willing to face them. And sometimes in the stillness of an evening like this, God begins speaking into places we've kept for far too long. If you're hearing your own story in this message today, understand this. God created humanity for relationship, stewardship, worship, and community. War exists because we live in a fallen world. So it should not surprise us that the human heart often struggles to carry what war places upon it. The burden many veterans feel is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that their conscience is still alive. And if your conscience is still alive, there is still hope. The gospel is not a message for people with small failures. The gospel is a message for people carrying impossible burdens. The grace of God is large enough to meet us in the darkest places of our lives, large enough to confront guilt, large enough to heal shame, large enough to restore what feels broken. No matter what you've seen, no matter what you've done, no matter how long you've carried it, there is hope. Next week, we're going to move from the traditional battlefield to a modern one. We'll explore the growing reality of moral injury among drone operators and remote warfighter crews. Warriors who may conduct lethal operations from thousands of miles away and then drive home to their families the very same day. It's a conversation our generation needs to have. If this message resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you know a veteran who needs to hear this message, share it with them. You can find my book, Moral Injury and Redemption, along with the faith-driven outdoor gear in the links below. This is Adkison Outdoors. Faith, freedom, family, and the outdoors. Until next time, leave tracks worth following in the woods and in your life. God bless.